Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our November 12th webinar, Membership Meetings, What Can Possibly Go Wrong? Famous last words, right? So I don't know if you realize this, but it occurred to me this morning as I was getting ready that this is our last webinar of 2025. This is it. We don't do anything in December, and we won't be back until January. So, wow. Can't believe the education season is over. Our 2026 classes are all up though on our website all year. It's done. Feel free to go on and register for whatever you want to register for next year, but we just won't be seeing you in December. So very sad. Well, my name is Alina Gilbert. For those of you who don't know me, I will be presenting today's webinars. And yes, you should expect many memes about meetings and other silly related things as I'm going through this. But before we get started, I do have a few housekeeping things I need to get through. And one of those is, for those of you who have not done a webinar with us before, your screen, or at least the bulk of it, should be the PowerPoint, which is that wonderful meeting that you have up there. Off to the left is your presenter, haha, me, hello. And to the right, kind of on top, you're going to see a little icon that says chat. So this is what you're going to use if you have questions while we go through all the materials. I do save questions for the end to make sure we have enough time to get through all the materials, but I also give you my email address. So if I don't get to all the questions, which sometimes we don't, you can shoot me an email. I try to answer them within a few days. I do the best I can, but you're definitely welcome to shoot me an email. Now, if you're having any audio or any video problems as we go through this, there is a little icon on the bottom that says audio or video problems. Click on that. It's going to take you through some steps, hopefully resolve the issue for you. You will also be getting 1 CMCA credit for attending the webinar today. That should get emailed to you probably yet today. The thing to remember with these is you need to save the image in the that you get in the email of the certificate. It goes away after 30 days. And so even if you save the email, if you don't save the image, it's going to go away. So please make sure you save that once you get it. As a reminder, we are recording today's presentation. It will be on our YouTube channel, probably by tomorrow. So if you just love this presentation today, and you want to tell other folks to watch it, they can watch it on YouTube. They just can't get the credit for it. And then last but not least, you will see a survey pop up at the end. And if you have time and the inclination, we always appreciate any feedback you can give us. No such thing as bad feedback. It's just feedback, and it helps us make our presentations a little bit better every year. So without further ado, why don't we go ahead and get started with actual materials? We have a lot of things we're going to cover today. And so I just want to make sure we get through everything and hopefully have a little bit of time for questions. So before we talk about all this other stuff, I think it's important to understand what a meeting is. And I think inherently people think they know what it is. But I think it's nice to be on the same page. And so what I have is 3 actual different definitions. The first 2, I kind of like the layperson definitions. One's from Webster's Dictionary, one's from Google, but then the bottom one, which of course is the longest, is Black's Law Dictionary, which is a legal dictionary for us attorneys. So, it makes sense. It's the most wordy definition that you're going to see. Now, if you look at all 3 of these definitions, the kind of common theme here is people getting together for a common purpose. Okay, so one thing to note is that it does not necessarily mean you have to make a decision. It could still be a meeting without any decisions being made. So a lot of times this comes up, and really comes up more with board meetings than homeowner meetings, but it still comes up in that, hey, we're having a working session. That's not a meeting. Well, technically it is. So just remember that the word meeting is a very, very broad definition, and even in the legal sense, it's a very broad definition. So don't assume that just because we are not making decisions, we didn't send notice, don't assume it's not a meeting. It's still a meeting. It just may be a different kind of meeting, but it is a meeting nonetheless. So you also know we have lots of different kinds of meetings in the HOA world, right? We've got board meetings, we've got membership meetings, and we've got other. Other is still taking action, but perhaps outside of a meeting. Now the board meetings, we have the regular board meetings. Sometimes we see special board meetings. We just mentioned working sessions, right? Which are technically meetings. So none of these are going to apply to today's presentation, because we're going to talk about membership meetings only, because that really tends to be where we see the most problems and where we see the most challenges. And it seems like no matter how much we talk about it, there's still, because there's so much information, there's so many things to remember and to know, it seems like there's always something going on, some sort of challenge to a membership meeting every now and then, or actually probably more often than that. So with respect to our membership meetings, there's generally 3 kinds of membership meetings. You guys have your annual meetings, you can have a special membership meeting, and you can have your budget ratification meeting. Anything else you're thinking of is likely going to fall under one of these categories. For example, in a couple of weeks, I'm going to a recall meeting. It's a special meeting of homeowners to vote on recalling the board. It still constitutes a special meeting. And the other, I did want to mention that because I will talk about it a little bit later on, but it's important to understand that the action by mail ballot, and honestly, the statute calls this action by written ballot, but most ballots are written, so it's kind of it's kind of confusing, right? What if you call it that? So I call it a mail ballot because it involves mailing ballots. And I do want to talk about it in a little bit of detail because I don't want it intermingled with voting at a meeting. And you'll see what I'm talking about as we keep going with the presentation. So I'm going to start with annual meetings. And again, remember, this is annual meetings of members. And I'm going to talk just about the various requirements. Now, these are requirements that are set forth in KIWA, Colorado Common Interest Ownership Act. It applies to all associations, old and new. So, a lot of times people say, well, my community was created before 1992, so does this apply? Yeah, it still applies to you. So, notice, annual meetings, notice, that's kind of the first place we can start making mistakes. So KIWA says you got to give notice no less than 10 or more than 50 days out. Your bylaws might have something different, but you should know that this 10 to 50 days is going to override anything you have in your bylaws. So this is really the requirement you need to comply with. Notices have to be either snail mailed or hand delivered. You got to use one of those two. It doesn't matter if you send it by email. It doesn't matter if you post it on the website. If you don't do either snail mail or hand delivery, it's not going to be a proper meeting because you did not comply with the notice requirements. Now, as an addition, KIWA does require physical posting of the meeting notice in a conspicuous location before the meeting. It doesn't say how far before the meeting. Typically, we'll say do it 24 hours, before the meeting. KIWA also encourages email notice for those homeowners who have requested it, but if you have people's email, there's certainly no harm in just email blasting it out to those individuals, whether they request it or not. Just keep in mind that your email notice is not instead of your snail mail or your hand delivery. If you are doing hand delivery, which I see very, very rarely, if you are doing it though, I would encourage all of you to get a signed acknowledgement of receipt from the homeowner when you give it to them, because first of all, physical delivery or in-hand delivery means you're handing it to the person, not sticking it to their door, not putting it underneath their door, means you're handing it to the homeowner. And the last thing we want is a homeowner showing up to a meeting say, I never got this, or they don't show up and later protest saying, since I never got the meeting notice, this was not a valid meeting. So you want to have some sort of evidence that you have hand delivered the notice to the correct individual. So that's essentially delivery of the notice. What does the notice actually have to have inside? Well, you know, a lot of the things that you would expect that you already put in your notices, right? The date of the meeting, what time the meeting is, where is the meeting, agenda, declaration and bylaw amendments, and proposals to remove directors. So we have a very specific provision in Kiowa that says you cannot vote on an amendment to your governing documents or move to remove any board members unless those items are set forth in your meeting notice and in your meeting agenda that goes with the meeting notice. Which means what? You can't have a motion from the floor saying, I vote, you know, we always have a hard time getting quorum. I motion we vote on an amendment to the bylaws to lower quorum so we can get quorum moving forward. Great sentiment, but guess what? Not good enough because it wasn't in the notice. Same thing with director removal. I have been to many annual meetings where you have an upset homeowner or a group of homeowners and they're like, well, I make a motion, I move, and you have to listen to me. I move that we vote right now on removing the entire board. And they are not real happy when I tell them, sorry, can't really do that. It wasn't in the meeting notice, and therefore it is not a proper voting subject at this time. Proxies. We're going to talk about proxies in some more detail moving forward, but proxies are, most of you, I think, attach form proxies for homeowners to use for the annual meeting, mostly, I think, because one, you want to make sure you get quorum, and that's one way to do it, right, is if people can't physically attend, they can submit their proxies, and then we can count them as being there. And also perhaps because we see a lot of times folks gathering proxies because they want to have a vote turn out a certain way, so they want to have as many votes as they can get by getting proxies. Absentee ballots. Okay, I have to put it on there. See the red capitalized letters? Absolutely not. It means no, don't. You cannot use absentee ballots when you are holding a meeting. Why? Well, because we have two separate legal processes that are contained in different statutes even. The voting at a meeting is discussed at Kiowa. Voting an absentee ballot is voting outside of a meeting. And there's only one way to do that, and that is discussed in the Nonprofit Act. And the two sections do not connect. They don't commingle, and you can't use a little bit of this section and a little bit of that section. It's either voting at a meeting or it's voting by a mail ballot, okay? And an absentee ballot would constitute a mail ballot, which can only be used when we are not holding a meeting. I know it's confusing. We'll talk about it more when I start talking about the mail ballot process at the end, but just keep in mind, any kind of ballots that get mailed in, okay, that is going to be our mail ballot process under the Nonprofit Act. When we are voting at a meeting, like electing directors, that is the process that's utilized in both Kiowa and typically your governing documents with respect to action during a meeting. Does this change if we are holding a virtual meeting? We still have lots of communities holding virtual meetings. So does this change? Well, the answer is no, it doesn't. It does not change. It makes things more complicated, I think, from an administrative perspective, as far as, getting people checked in. How do you accept proxies at a virtual meeting, right? How do we do that? How do we vote if we have to do secret ballots? Those are all really good questions and challenges associations face when holding virtual meetings. But even though they're virtual, they are still meetings, and we still have to comply with all of these requirements as far as how we get the notice delivered, when we get it delivered, what the notice has. So just as an FYI, if you are holding a virtual meeting, an annual meeting, what do you do with the location, right? Because Kiowa says you got to have a location in your notice. Well, typically we say put the address. Usually it's the management company who's ever hosting the virtual meeting, and add something in bold big letters that says attendance is only virtual, no in-person attendance, so people don't show up at the address. But technically, if we want to be 100% in compliance with Kiowa, we got to have a location. Okay. Proxies. Let's talk about some proxies. I saw we had a few questions pop up here that talk about proxies, so hopefully we answered them in this section. So here's the deal with proxies. We have to allow them. Okay, legally it is the same as an owner physically showing up to a meeting. Okay, so for our purposes and pursuant to Kiowa, homeowners can attend meetings in person, and they can attend them by proxy. Same thing, they're still considered there. Okay, so does that mean we always have to provide proxy forms to our owners? And this is perhaps one of the most difficult things, I think, for homeowners to accept, is that associations have no duty, no requirement under the law to provide homeowners with proxy forms. You could send an annual meeting notice without the proxy. It doesn't mean you won't accept proxies. We still have to accept them, but we don't have to provide the forms. Now, in most cases, does it make sense for us to provide the forms? Yes, because like I said, it makes it a little bit easier on the administrative side to, you at least know what those proxies say, and you don't have to try to figure out, what a makeshift proxy, whether it's good or bad, whether you should accept it or not accept it. You know, when you use association drafted proxies, that at least they're valid proxies, assuming they're signed and dated. Okay, but just remember, there's a distinction between being required to accept them versus providing the form. So there's two kinds of proxies. Well, no, there's really three. There's directed proxies, general proxies, and then quorum-only proxies. And it really just depends on how they're drafted. A directed proxy says, this is how I want my proxy holder to vote. A general proxy says, my proxy holder can vote however they want to vote. And quorum only says, this is for quorum purposes only. So this is a proxy that does not get voted. It just counts towards the quorum requirement. One thing I always like pointing out is with directed proxies that tell the proxy holder how to vote. I have a lot of directors and some managers who say, well, how do we make sure that the person who has that proxy is voting in the way that they were instructed to vote on the proxy? Well, my answer to that is you don't. That's not your job. The proxy is between the person who issued it and the person who's using it, who's the proxy holder. If the proxy holder doesn't do what the proxy issuer wanted them to do, that's between them. That's not an association issue. We don't enforce whether proxy holders vote the way they were instructed to vote. Okay, so keep that in mind because this comes up over and over and over again. Obviously, with a directed or with a general proxy, you don't have that issue because it just says the proxy holder can vote however they want. Proxies are revocable. They are revocable in one of two ways. One is you attend the meeting and vote, or you have a written revocation that gets delivered to the secretary of the association, and that could be through the managing agent, but it basically is a written revocation. Requirements under the statutes. There's very, very, very few requirements as to what a proxy needs to look like. What it says is it has to be in writing, it has to be signed. That's really all it says. Now, obviously, practically, we need to be able to know if the proxy's being issued to someone. If it's not, then we use it for quorum purposes only. We need to be able to identify who the signator is or was, so we can confirm it's a homeowner who issued it versus, a tenant or something like that. But short of that, it can be written on a napkin. It can be written on a plastic bag for all I care, and it doesn't matter. So a lot of mistakes happen with proxies where associations are like, well, I can't take this. This isn't the proxy form we gave you, or this isn't a real proxy. It's on a napkin. Oh, so what? As long as it's written and signed, that's all we need. Do we care who the proxy is issued to? Well, we might care, but we can't do anything about it. Proxies can be issued to anyone. You cannot require that it be issued to another owner. A proxy can be given to the garbage man for all we care, and the garbage man can come to the meeting and vote the proxy. Important to remember that proxies are not ballots. Okay? Proxies are not ballots. We actually have ballots in which you cast the vote, but proxies are not them. Proxies, whether it's a directed proxy or not, gets exchanged for a ballot, and then the proxy holder fills out the written ballot. You should not be using proxies as ballots because legally they are not. And I have seen associations do this before. They're like, well, they're already marked, how to vote, so we'll just use that as the ballot. And then usually it's an election, gets challenged, and doesn't end up going too well for the association. Proxies are just not ballots. And I know it's semantics, but it's the law. And I always tell people logic is here, the law is way over there. And so don't expect it necessarily to be logical or to make sense. You just have to accept it for what it is. That's the way the law is written. Okay. So when it comes to voting, so we do have our written ballots. Kiowa says you can also vote by a show of hands. You can do a voice vote. And you can do for elections acclamation, which means we have 5 people running for 5 positions. No need to use ballots. You're automatically on the board by acclamation. So that is certainly options. However, there are situations when we need to use secret ballots. If you're using secret ballots, you're obviously not doing a show of hands, you're not doing the voice, and you're not doing acclamation. That's going to be a written ballot. So when do we need to do secret ballots? Kiowa says if it's a contested election. If you've got more people running than positions available, it's a contested election, you've got to do secret ballot unless you're in a delegate district where the delegates do the voting. In that case, Kiowa says the delegate districts are not subject to this requirement. You also have to do secret ballots if requested by 20% of the homeowners who are present. So it's not 20% of everyone, it's not 20% of quorum, it's 20% of those who are at the meeting, including the proxies. So if 20% of the owners say, hey, we want to vote on this document amendment, which was properly noticed, and we want a secret ballot, guess what? You're going to have to do it, if the requisite number of homeowners request it. That could be a problem if you're not prepared to do that. Also, you would need secret ballots if your governing documents require them for certain situations. Unfortunately, there are lots of documents, especially older ones, that require secret ballots for all elections. So even if they're not contested, you got one person running for one position, they still require a secret ballot. Okay. Be careful of those provisions because technically you got to comply with them, and if you don't, your election is going to be subject to challenge. I see, oh, hold on a second. I have a note in here from one of my partners, David Clausen. He's awesome. He says, I believe section 310 of Kiowa also requires the proxy to be dated. Thank you, sir. Okay, that's one more requirement. Add that to your notes. It also has to be dated. And proxies are good for up to 11 months. Just, I think most of you are aware of that, unless a shorter term is specified on the proxy. So then the question is, well, what if there's a longer term specified on the proxy? Then it's not going to be valid. It's only good for the 11 months. It used to be, until a few years back, when the statute changed, it used to be able, we could say this is good for every annual meeting until I revoke this proxy. Can't do that anymore because the statute has changed and now it cannot exceed the 11 months. All right. Ballots. The biggest thing about ballots is counting them, the election ballots. Kiowa has some pretty specific requirements. It has to be a neutral third party. And what I've seen associations do is they've had people from like the CPA's office come and do the counting. I've seen people hire a third party, like accountant type person, come and count. I've seen all sorts of things that associations got very creative with. But it can also be a committee of volunteers who have to be unit owners, who are selected during the meeting in a fair manner, can't be board members, and can't be candidates. I once attended an annual meeting where the board took this very seriously, and everybody who walked in the door at the annual meeting got a little lottery ticket, and that's how they picked their counters, was through the lottery ticket. They didn't give them to the board members, they didn't give them to the folks who were running, but they gave them to everyone else, and that's how they got their various counting committee created. And that was pretty cool. It was a lot of work, but getting all those tickets, it was a pretty huge meeting, but that certainly is an option. All right. I'm going to shift gears. I'm going to move to budget meetings now. Now remember, budget meetings are still homeowner meetings. When it comes to the notice, the big difference here is the timing is what the bylaws dictate. So we said, remember we said Kiowa's 10 to 50 days? Yes, Kiowa is 10 to 50 days. But with budget meetings, Kiowa says you got to follow the requirements of your bylaws. So if your bylaws are not consistent with Kiowa and they have something like 30 to 60 days, that's what you got to follow, okay? Don't insist on the 10 to 50 when it comes to your budget meetings. Check the bylaws. As far as delivering the notice, same thing, same method of delivery. Quorum. Now, budget meetings under Kiowa do not require a quorum of owners to attend. Remember, quorum is the minimum number of members who have to be present in person or by proxy for business to be transacted. Well, the budget meeting is going to be the only meeting of homeowners that you are going to be able to have, at least for the time being, at which quorum is not required, which means you can have one person show up, You can have 10 people show up, or you can have the whole community show up. For the purposes of this meeting, it's going to be proper, okay? So then what is this other stuff I have there? If separate meeting, if part of annual meeting. Well, what a lot of associations still tend to do is they don't hold a separate budget ratification meeting, and instead they hold their annual meeting with budget ratification being just the line item on the agenda, which you have every right to do that. That's not unlawful. However, keep in mind, if you're not calling a separate budget ratification meeting and you're calling an annual meeting, you do have a quorum requirement for annual meetings. So let's say it's 10% of your owners, you got to make sure 10% or more of the owners are there. If they're not, you don't get to ratify the budget because you're not holding a budget ratification meeting, you're holding an annual meeting, and this is nothing more than an agenda line item. So for our purposes, and what I typically recommend is don't do it at the same meeting. Do it as 2 meetings, back to back, same night. You can even have one piece of paper doing the notice for both meetings, notice of budget ratification meeting and annual meeting. And budget ratification meeting starts at 6 p.m. Annual meeting begins immediately after adjournment of budget meeting. So you can do it, you can use one piece of paper. It's semantics, but you do have to set it up as 2 separate meetings. That way, if you cannot get quorum for your annual meeting, you've still ratified your budget during the budget ratification meeting, which comes first. Okay, and then you're not suffering being stuck with your old budget because you couldn't get it ratified. So keep that in mind when it comes to quorum. I have been to several meetings where unfortunately I've had to tell the manager, you don't have quorum, they can't ratify the budget. Obviously that does not go over well with anyone. So don't put yourself in that position. Make sure you do your budget ratification meeting separately, or realize that you still need quorum to ratify. So the other question and confusion that I see a lot is, are you voting on the budget or what is it? Well, technically what Kiowa says is unless a majority of all owners or a higher percentage that may be specified in your declaration veto the budget, it is automatically ratified. That is the terminology used by Kiowa. What does it mean? Well, what most of the time happens is you go to your budget ratification meeting. You don't have a majority of all your owners showing up. Typically, you don't have more than 50%. If that's the case, then all you need to do is say, call the meeting to order. We don't have enough owners present at the meeting. This includes, again, in person and by proxy, to veto the budget. Therefore, it is automatically ratified, meeting adjourned. If you have questions about the budget that you want to talk about it, we will have a discussion section during the annual meeting. But let's close off the ratification meeting and move into our annual meeting. Okay, that's usually how it plays out. If you do have more than 50% of your homeowners present, then you might need to have a vote. Because how else are you going to know if more than 50% of your homeowners are going to veto the budget? If you have exactly 51%, you can say, how many of you are here to veto the budget? And if it's like half the room, you know it's not going to pass. It's not ratified. So there's different ways of doing the budget ratification meeting, but in most cases, we don't need to do an actual vote. But I think in some cases you might need to. And the process is pretty much what I just said, right? It's you hold the meeting, you call it to order. If you don't have enough folks present to veto, it's automatically ratified and you adjourn. The reason I'm saying adjourn is because you don't want like another 100 homeowners showing up in the next 25 minutes while you're arguing over the budget and be like, oh yeah, we all want to veto. I mean, not that that would happen, but still, why open yourself up to the risk? Call it, it's ratified, end it, move to annual meeting. Now, we're going to move on to special meetings of members. Who calls those? Well, we got three options here. So we got the board president has the right to call a special meeting of members. A majority of the directors can call a special meeting of owners, or homeowners representing 20% of the votes or more can demand the board call a special meeting. Now, keep in mind, regardless of what your documents might say, 20% is the cap. You can't require more than 20% of all the owners to request the meeting. A lot of bylaws will say 25%. I've seen 30%. Those are not going to be valid. It's going to be 20%. Okay? So just be careful with that. But if you get a petition from 20% that's signed by 20% of your homeowners, you got to call a meeting. There's a timing here. And this is all under the Nonprofit Act. It says from the day you get the petition, you have 30 days to send out the notice of the meeting. That means within that 30 days, you're going to be going through the petition. You're going to be making sure that, you know, there's at least 20% of the homeowners represented, that it's actually homeowners who signed versus renters or non-owners or non-members. And assuming you conclude that, yes, this is correct, you would then, by day 30, you are required to send out the notice of the special meeting. And remember, the notice it's sent out in the same way as your annual meeting. The delivery is the same as your annual meeting, and it's still a 10 to 50 day out requirement under Kiowa. So what does that mean? Hypothetically, it means I get the petition on day 1. I could wait until day 30 to send the notice, and I could make the notice up to 50 days out. So if I really wanted to stretch this out, I could make this an 80-day process from when I received the petition from the homeowners. That's not unlawful. I'm working with a board that's doing that right now. Now, does that make homeowners unhappy? Sometimes. Because usually it depends on, you know, if it's a recall petition, right, we want to remove the board, the homeowners want it done. They want it done as soon as possible. But if it gets stretched out, the longer it gets stretched out, the more upset they tend to get. Is that a problem? I don't know. I don't know your individual communities. It could be, but it's not unlawful. So you could do that. You could stretch it out the 80 days. You do have to provide an agenda with the notice. And the one thing to be aware of with special meetings is ain't nothing coming from the floor. You can only take action on the items that are on the agenda in the meeting notice, nothing above that. So how does that work with respect to a recall meeting? Here's how I've seen things go wrong. Homeowners submit a petition to the board. We want a special meeting to vote on removing the board, the entire board. Board confirms, sends out notice of the meeting, says the purpose of the meeting is to vote on removal of the entire board. People show up to the meeting, the board is removed. What's next? Can't elect, didn't put anything on the agenda about that. So I have no board. Not a good way to go. So kind of, you want to always think these things through a little bit and make sure that you're putting everything on the agenda that you might need, depending on the type of special meeting it is. So yes, if it's a recall meeting, we definitely want to have something in the agenda that says an election will be held to replace any removed directors. Okay. And then who runs the meeting? While the board is the board, while the current board members are on the board, remember, it's the president technically who runs meetings, and that can be delegated. So that can be delegated to another board member, to the community manager. You can have the parliamentarian there that the board delegates that to. You can have the attorney there. You delegate that to, but it's going to be the board's decision. One thing is, what happens if you don't get the meeting notice out within the 30 days? Then the homeowners can call the meeting. They call it how they want, when they want. They're going to be running it, and the board's going to have no control over it. And that's probably not a great situation to be in, especially if it's a recall meeting. So you really want to make sure that when you do get these kinds of requests for special meetings, that you are sending the notice out within 30 days. All right, action by mail ballot. And the reason I want to talk about it is, like I said earlier, action by mail ballot is a separate legal process from when you take action at a meeting. Okay, this is a procedure that is set forth in the Nonprofit Act, not in Kiowa, it's in the Nonprofit Act. And it exists for homeowners to vote on things outside of a meeting. This is outside of a meeting. Just remember that. So you can't combine action by mail ballot with a meeting because they're just two separate processes. So what does that mean? It means no meeting. It also means no proxies. Why no proxies? Because proxies are the documents that allow homeowners to attend meetings when they can't physically be there. Since there's no meeting, there's no proxy. If you want to vote on something, you do that by returning your ballot, not by showing up somewhere. So there's no proxies. There are some pretty specific requirements of information that needs to be contained both in the ballot solicitation letter and in the ballot itself, that if you don't comply with every single one of them, it's not going to be a ballot action and it's going to be subject to challenge. Just some of the big ticket items are, you need to have a specific date, time, deadline when ballots have to be received, not when they have to be mailed, but when they have to be received to be counted. You need to set forth what the approval requirement is. You have to tell people what quorum is. This gets a lot of associations in trouble because what they do, like we'll draft a ballot solicitation letter, we'll put all this information in there, and then let's say they're voting on an amended and restated declaration, which requires like 2/3 of all homeowners to approve. So the board looks at our letter, they say, well, who cares about quorum? It's not really relevant here, and they just take it out. And they send everything out. Guess what that means? That means they didn't comply with statutory requirements of a mail ballot, and that whole vote is not valid. And I hate being the bearer of bad news to boards and to managers about this, but unfortunately, we got to follow everything in the statute to a T. So if please make sure you have your attorneys drafting these things. And if you're drafting them, have your attorneys review them. And if you don't like something that the attorney puts in to the document, you better talk to the attorney about it before just deleting it and sending it out. The other thing that's required is to provide the voters with enough information for them to make an educated decision. That's a pretty broad statement, but obviously more is more. So if it's a vote on, updated documents, you need to have your documents in there. You might want to have a summary of what the big changes are. You might want to have, something else in there. If it's a special assessment that people are voting on, you might want to add documents as far as what the work is going to be. Usually it's for repairs, re-roofing, whatever. You might want to add a copy of the contract or the bid or something so the homeowners know exactly what that money is going towards so they can make an educated decision. Okay. Finally, with the ballots, there is no revocation on the mail ballot. So once it's gone and once it's out of your hands as a homeowner, it's out of your hands. You cannot change your vote. And the other thing to remember is you also cannot extend the deadline. So you want to be sure that you're allowing enough time for the ballots to come in to get enough votes. Now, it can't be more than, the law is 60 days from when you received your first ballot. We don't know when we're going to receive our first ballot. So when we draft these, we say 60 days is safe, probably could go up to 61, maybe 62 days from when you send everything out. but no more than that, okay? I know there's a lot here. I'm kind of done with that part of it. I just want to talk about some common mistakes, some of which we have covered, some of which we have not, and I think we can do it and still have a few minutes for questions. So, improper notice, no snail mail, no physical posting. I have a lot of associations that tell me, Alina, I'm not going to post. Why not? Because then everyone's going to know when they drive by that people are at this meeting and therefore all the houses are going to get robbed. At first I thought that was silly, and then I heard more and more and more boards talk about that and community managers talk about that. So I don't know. The problem here is that it's a legal requirement. So if you're not posting, you're technically violating the law, which means your meeting is subject to challenge. So, you know, that's not a good place to be in. Improper proxy requirements, submission deadlines. Let's talk about that for a minute. Submission deadlines, you know, requiring owners use a specific format, requiring proxies be issued to only owners. So what I want to make very clear is Kiowa is very specific in that homeowners can attend meetings in one of two ways. They can attend in person and they can attend by proxy. Okay, proxy is still attendance at a meeting. And when I see boards trying to adopt rules or policies that say if you're going to be attending by proxy, you need to have the proxy submitted 5 days before the meeting start date. Unless you're planning on telling homeowners they have to line up outside the clubhouse 5 days before the meeting start date, you're not going to tell people they have to submit their proxies 5 days before. I am attending via proxy, and I can attend just like any homeowner who's physically attending, which means I can give my proxy the day of the meeting, okay? So please don't fall into that way of thinking that, you know, we can impose various restrictions and requirements on these proxies. We really can't do a whole heck of a lot with them, okay? Like I said, we can't require that they be given to a specific person, that they be a specific format. And if multiple proxies are issued, sometimes I see those get denied. Well, not so fast, because when you have more than one proxy, the one that's most recent is the one we would use. And the only time we would not accept any of those proxies is if they were issued on the same date and we have no way of knowing of what came first. Even so, I would still say use those proxies for quorum purposes, just not for voting purposes. So those are traps that a lot of associations fall into. And I just want you all to be very careful with these situations. Calculating quorum. Another gigantic issue that I have seen is sometimes your documents will say quorum is 10% of the total votes in the association. Sometimes your documents will say quorum is 10% of the eligible votes in the community or the eligible voters. So there's a difference, right? Because an eligible voter, however that's defined, typically means it's someone who is, you know, not delinquent on their assessments, not in violation of the covenants. And if they are, then your documents may say this person is not entitled to vote. They're not entitled to vote, they're not an eligible voter, and they cannot be counted towards quorum if that is the requirement of quorum. So be very careful when you are calculating quorum. Associations preparing their own mail ballots. Again, we talked about why that's a problem. Absentee ballots, which are mail ballots, combined with meetings, can't do that. Proxies combined with mail ballots. Again, we talked about why that's not something that can be done either. Ratifying your budget during an annual meeting when you don't have a quorum, talked about that. Counting ballots. Do your owners have equal voting or weighted voting? sometimes we see really odd provisions, especially in older documents, and they'll say assessments are equal, but voting is not equal. Voting is based on Exhibit B or percentages. It's based on square footage. And sometimes we'll see boards, they'll be like, oh, well, if we have, equal assessments, that must mean we have equal voting, and that's not always the case. So don't make that assumption. Know how the voting is supposed to be counted. To make things worse, I've seen some documents that say, if you're voting on this, it's equal. If you're voting on this, it's not equal. If you're voting on that, it's some other kind of, accounting process. So never assume, read through the whole document, ask your attorneys if you're not sure, because I've seen all sorts of convoluted language when it comes to counting the ballots and how much each ballot is worth. And then finally, again, we talked about this, voting on amendments or on a director removal issue at an annual meeting or any meeting when it's not on the agenda. These cannot be motions from the floor. Okay. Whew. Yes, so if you're lonely, there you have it, hold a meeting. I'm going to go through as many questions as I can. Give me 1 second here. I gotta get to my, all right. In the meantime, I will insist you enjoy Dancing Chicken and Dancing Pig. All right. Can posting on a website count as, I think this means notice. It's part of notice, but it's not going to be enough if you're not snail mailing or hand delivering. Let's see. Can you send a notice and state for agenda and other Can you send a notice and state that for the agenda and other documents, check your email in order to save costs on mailing copies? Some things yes, some things no. And you'd probably want to consult with legal counsel. So for example, if you're sending out notice of a meeting to vote on amended documents, because you're doing it at a meeting, you would have to send a copy of those documents. A lot of things you can refer to and say, here's the link to them. But if someone calls and says, I don't have a computer, I don't have good internet, I need a copy, you have to provide them a copy at no additional charge. Okay. Is the agenda required in the mailing for an annual meeting where the normal order of business is taking place, i.e., no upheaval of the board or discussion outside what is designated on the notice? Under Kiowa, you're supposed to have an agenda included. So if you don't include the agenda, which I know a lot of folks don't, it could be a challenge to the validity of the notice if there's no agenda included. So I would not take that risk, and I would include the agenda. See, if an abusive board president has stated that no nominations for the board will be accepted at the annual homeowners meeting, but the bylaws state that the board nominations will be at the annual meeting, what rules, bylaws, or policies and procedures do we? Okay, so ultimately it sounds like a board president doesn't want to accept nominations from the floor. You have to accept nominations from the floor. That would be a violation of the spirit of Kiowa that says you can run and any qualifications have to be set forth in the governing document. So unless your qualification says, you have to submit your nomination form 5 days before the vote or whatever, I would argue that you absolutely have to allow nominations from the floor, and failing to do so could very easily invalidate your election. Let's see. Who can you give a proxy to? Well, so that's anybody, absolutely anybody. If someone requests a proxy for a virtual budget ratification meeting, can we accept that proxy and vote counted when they return it? So again, remember, you have to accept proxies for all meetings. Now, if it's a budget ratification meeting and somebody created their own proxy, so be it, you got to take it. When it's a virtual meeting, it makes it a little more difficult. So I would recommend having some sort of a virtual meeting policy in place if you are doing these types of things consistently virtually, so that you have a system and a process in place that's very clear and that homeowners can look at and know exactly how that's going to work. And also so the board can follow it and management can follow it. Let's see. I am a solo on-site manager. Can I accept nominations to vote on proxies? I mean, I think if you're the designated person to whom nominations are being sent, I don't see why not. That's fine, unless their governing documents somehow prohibit it. I'd be very surprised if they did. How do you do the secret ballot at the meeting, just so I am clear? Well, it would have to be a ballot with no identifying information or marks on it. So essentially be a piece of paper, no address, no signature of the owner, and gets turned in. So when the counters look at it, they don't know who voted how. So that's the best way I can think of. Sometimes it gets convoluted though, if you have weighted voting, because you kind of still have to indicate the voting percentages, and that makes it not necessarily secret. So, but there's really not a good way around it. Just confirming, a proxy form must be signed and dated to be valid. Correct. Are members allowed to go to the budget meeting, or is it just for the board members? No, owners can go to any meetings of the board, whether an official meeting or a working session. You don't necessarily have to give them notice of it, but if they show up and they want to listen, absolutely. If you're talking about the meeting where the homeowners ratify the budget, we absolutely need homeowners at that one. If you send out an annual meeting notice, everything is proper, and you don't get quorum, do you have to try to have that meeting again? I've seen managers set a second date and resend the notice. I've seen managers write minutes that simply state quorum not achieved, no meeting held, and that's the end of it. Is this an actual requirement? So under statutes, there's nothing that requires you to try to hold another meeting. Best practices will dictate that you try at least twice to get a quorum. If you don't try twice, if you try once and one and done, it's not a violation of the law, but I think it could raise eyebrows. It could make homeowners feel like the board is like trying to get away with something. So I think it becomes more of a political issue at that point than a legal issue. And one other thing to watch out for is those governing documents that require you to try again. So even though the law doesn't require you to do it, your documents still might. So you should review your documents to make sure that that it's not required if you're not going to do it. We sent a non-directed proxy form with the annual meeting notice. The homeowner handwrites a note directing how to vote on a single topic. What do I do with that? Well, as I said before, we are not the enforcers of their instructions to their proxy holders, so there's nothing you do with that. You exchange it for a ballot, and it's between the proxy issuer and the proxy holder. Does Kiowa trump the declaration? Declaration says unless at that meeting a majority of all lot owners present at the meeting in person by proxy reject the budget is ratified, whether or not a quorum is present. So it's what you just read. Let's see, unless a majority of all lot owners present. Yeah, it's going to be trumped by Kiowa. It's mandatory. So you will be required, I mean, the minimum is a majority of all owners to veto the budget. I would go ahead and consult with the association's attorney, get a formal legal opinion. You guys, it's 1 o'clock. I know I have not gotten to all the questions. Feel free to email me if I didn't get to yours. I'll try to get to it as soon as I can. But I appreciate you all attending. I hope you all have a great holiday, a great new year, gobble, gobble, all that stuff. And if you have time to fill out the survey, please do. Thanks so much. Bye.